This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, Manisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on the Hill, podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-militarism, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Jovanni, your host. Thank you for being with us today. Today, I'm joined by friend of the show, Jake Tucker. Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you for coming. Recent developments have shaped the West Asian landscape, and more specifically, the Levant region. Let's start with the ceasefire. The mighty Israeli war machine, after 15 months, have failed in defeating regional resistance forces such as Hamas and Hezbollah. After 56 days of intense fighting, Israel's attempted incursion into southern Lebanon has come to a halt for now. Gradual truce follows weeks of clashes with Hezbollah and Israel's failure to gain a foothold in southern Lebanon, a conflict that threatened to spiral into a full-scale regional war. But pause or the calm before an even bigger storm. Meanwhile, in Gaza, a ceasefire has taken hold, brokered in the early days of Donald Trump's presidency. This agreement not only halted the Zionist onslaught of Palestinians, but also led to historic prisoner exchange, return of 3 captive female Israeli soldiers in exchange for 183 Palestinian captives held by Israel. While some call it a step towards peace, others see it as another chapter in a never-ending cycle of violence and negotiation. But the story doesn't end there. Syria, once a unified state, has fallen into chaos. The Assad government has been overthrown, withstanding 12 gruesome years of global dirty war. Now Damascus is under the control of former ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters, with former al-Nusra commander Ahmed Hussein al-Sharan, also known as Mohammed al-Juliani, taking over the presidency. In a stunning turn of events, Western, Russian, and Gulf Cooperation Council governments have been meeting with al-Juliani to establish relations, signaling a dramatic shift in geopolitical landscape and legitimizing an individual who belonged to an organization the West has spent the last 25 years waging war against, Al-Qaeda. Syria today is a patchwork of occupation and conflict. Israel, Turkey, and the United States have carved out their own zones of control, while various militia factions by these powers fight for dominance. In the north, U.S.-backed Kurdish forces clash with Turkish-backed militias. In the other areas, Syrian ethnic minorities are being cleansed by forces allied with al-Juliani, adding another layer of violence to an already fractured nation. Meanwhile, Lebanon's Hezbollah continue to recover from the Israeli decapitation strike last September, which took out much of the senior leadership, including the much-esteemed leader Hassan Nasrallah. This attack was preceded by an Israeli mass attack using explosive pagers and cell phones that killed and injured thousands. On top of that, Lebanon has a new president, General Joseph Khalid al. What does this mean in relations to the Lebanese-Israeli relations and Lebanese relations with the West? Lebanon has been under sanctions for some years now and has its critical infrastructure, from the streets of Gaza to the hills of southern Lebanon, from the ruins of Syria to the negotiation tables of global powers. This is a story of resilience, resistance, and reckoning. It's about the human cost of war, the politics of power, the lines we draw in the sand, only to watch them be withdrawn with blood. Here to join us and speak more about the matter is Dr. Anis Giuliani. Dr. Giuliani is a medical doctor, health policy specialist, and activist based in Lebanon. His work revolves around social health protection, the political economy of health, and the integration of artificial intelligence into healthcare. Dr. Germani, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good to be here. Thank you. How are you guys?
Doing well. Speak to us about your work.
My work, it's mostly centered around medicine and health policy. I care about the things that matter in the US, access to healthcare, insurance, affordable care, universal health coverage, also the right of people to access this care, the economics, the political economy that makes sure that a lot of people are excluded from accessing care or making it unaffordable. This is mostly my work. Obviously, I am drawn into the world of politics. I've been an activist for many years now. I take a particular interest in Lebanon since I am a Lebanese citizen and I live here. Once you delve into Lebanese politics, you cannot avoid geopolitics because Lebanon is a field where many powers have influence, not just because Lebanon has a strategic value in the Levant, but also because of the nature of the Lebanese system that makes sure that every leader has a patron, which is a foreign power. So from that perspective, mix a lot of things together. There's the domestic and the foreign, and they interact. Sometimes they blow up. Sometimes they stabilize the country despite terrible circumstances.
Speak to us a little bit more about that. What's the social fabric of Lebanon and its political structure? You just mentioned how each political actor is sponsored foreign actor, right? What?
So Lebanon follows a sectarian system. There is a president, prime minister, parliament, cabinet, but the division of these positions is based on sect. For example, among Muslims, there's Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, Christians, Maronite, Orthodox, many sects in Lebanon. And each sect has a certain piece of the government. For example, the president should be Maronite Christian, the prime minister should be a Muslim Sunni, and the speaker of parliament should be Muslim Shia. This is one example of many, because this also applies to everything in public administration as well. And also how you vote. So you vote for the representative of your sect. This obviously creates a lot of problems in Lebanon. The structure of the system is based on stabilizing and upholding tensions. So there always has to be sectarian tensions, but not enough for it to blow up. This was established during the Civil War, particularly in the 1980s. The Civil War was from 75 until 91. During the 80s, this is when the system took place. You had the collaboration between financial interests, sectarian interests, and political interests. Of course, sectarianism is not new, neither in Lebanon nor in the region. It was something imposed during the colonial era, particularly during the French mandate over Lebanon. This also applied to all other countries of the region. But Lebanon has a particular case where you have many sects inside a small country, each a vehicle for power and financial interests. At the top tier, and from a class perspective, the most powerful and the richest people do not abide by sectarian cultural divides. You'll see them intermarrying, having business together, doing whatever they want together. They make deals. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they don't. For them, this is not a problem. But for everybody else, there has to be a minimum of tensions to justify the legitimacy of the system. We were led to believe, especially from the 80s onwards, that the only thing keeping us from killing each other is the fact that we have the system where we divide positions, financial interests, and land based on sects. Of course, this is not true at all. This is a fictitious narrative to justify the system. But for now, it is what it is. In 2019, there was an economic collapse that basically disrupted one of the core foundations of the system. On one hand, when you divide public administration by sects, you're not doing it for the interest of the people. Of course, you also don't have always the best people in charge. And your interests as somebody who is in charge from a certain sect is not to serve all of the Lebanese population. It is to serve a specific sect. This creates huge problems when you're running it from one administration. Social services in Lebanon have always been a disaster. They're insufficient. They're inaccessible. But there was this compensation mechanism that was created, whereby whenever a certain person from a certain sect is in power, they would provide for the people that are from their own sect. However, in 2019, when the economic collapse happened, the ability for them to do that was completely disrupted because they used to take public funds to give their people healthcare, jobs, education, all of the things that they were supposed to have as citizens. Since then, Lebanon has been going through a very chaotic period. The last 5 years were extremely chaotic, mainly due to the economic collapse that has undermined the social contract of Lebanon and additional crises that have made things worse. We had the COVID pandemic. In 2020, we had the August 4th port blast that destroyed half of Beirut. And we recently had the war for the past year with Israel. And it was also a very destructive war. So now that all of these challenges have compounded, the situation is untenable. It's evidenced by many things. Migration is the first one. Since 2019, 500,000 people have left the country. The businesses are down. The GDP has shrunk significantly. We were at 50 billion GDP before the crisis. Now we're at around $18 billion. So this is more than half of the GDP gone. Recently, we've seen a rise in crime that is very alerting in Lebanon, particularly also that has to do with Syria and the instability that's happening there and the war itself. So yeah, Lebanon is in a very tough place. This is mainly due to the way the country is governed, not the people themselves, but the system, how it functions, how people perceive power, how they perceive their own interests. And yeah, but for now things are the way they are. There isn't much contestation towards that, but at the same time, the situation is untenable. I think people are very tired and also very broken, and this is why, for now, things are on a more stable path. There are sanctions. The effect of sanctions is not that pronounced. In Lebanon, there's two camps. If you want to boil it down between these sects, you have the pro-Western camp and the pro-resistance camp, but this is like an oversimplification. They will collaborate when the economic collapse happened, and the bankers turned out to have exploited people's money and wasted it for their own profit. Because bankers are from all sects, you will see the pro-resistance and anti-resistance camp collaborating together to make sure that their financial interests are also secure. So the thing about sanctions is that both camps promote this narrative because it overshadows the actual nature of the crisis. The private banking system ruined the Lebanese economy. The sanctions narrative tells you something else. The pro-resistance camp says the US imposing sanctions on Lebanon, and therefore this is why we have a crisis. The anti-resistance camp tells you it is because we have a resistance that we have sanctions, so we need to get rid of them to have a prosperous economy. In both cases, both narratives are wrong. Yes, there are sanctions, but they are not the cause of Lebanon's economic difficulties. One simple example to the contrary is that from the GDP that we have, this 18 billion, we have between 6 billion that come from remittances. This is a country where money keeps on coming in. The idea is if we had sanctions, the money would not have been able to come into Lebanon at all. And this would be the cause of our problem. Once you lift the sanctions, things would somewhat go back to normal. In Lebanon's case, money is still coming in. The nature of the economic system is a rentier economy that is not productive. So we'll just waste whatever money comes in because we waste it on import. Lebanon produces absolutely nothing. Like 90% of our food is imported. The sanctions narrative should not be the core of the diagnosis of the crisis that happened in Lebanon.
Thank you for that. The question that makes me curious about, and maybe this takes you in a very complicated direction, but what would be necessary to overcome this political and social situation imposed over decades by collaboration between imperialism, colonialism, and the ruling class of Lebanon?
Yeah, it has to be a massive overhaul. Simple solutions will not yield anything because this is almost a century of collaboration, and that has seeped into the culture. It's culturally how we perceive ourselves in Lebanon that has changed over time because of these influences. So definitely there has to be a different way of us perceive ourselves in Lebanon as citizens and how we perceive power and the Lebanese entity as a unit. This starts by establishing a secular state that represents people as citizens, that have rights, that have obligations, not as a conglomeration of sects. This has to be the starting point. And from that, we can start diagnosing the situation. We'll look at many things. Of course, we'll have to look at the economy as one of the major priorities. From that perspective, we'll see that the banking system has failed. It is completely bankrupt. This is why the bankers responsible for this crisis should be the ones to pay back the money that they have illegally taken and stolen. At the same time, this will not be enough. Of course, having a functioning banking sector is essential in a world of global capitalism, because this is how we communicate with the world economically. But we also have to look at Lebanon from an economic perspective in terms of its sectors. What does Lebanon produce? Today, the answer is almost nothing. We have to launch a huge reconstruction campaign of the infrastructure, not only that was destroyed by the war, but also through neglect, years of austerity. Since 1995, Lebanon has been under staunch austerity. We need to invest in it a lot more. This will create jobs. We also need to develop specific sectors. What does Lebanon want to? We can do anything. If we want to work in industry, we can. If we want to work in tech production, we could. There has to be a will behind it, a political will to do it, and a plan to enact. Otherwise, nothing's going to work. Things do not happen without a modicum of a plan. Even the US, that champions liberal and open economies, has certain plans. So once they want to compete, for example, in AI with China, they will invest. They will make sure that there's money. They'll give it to certain companies, set targets that they would like to reach. Lebanon should be doing the same. We can't just wander through the wilderness and hope for somebody like a country to give us money at some point so that we could just extend the lifespan of the system and waste this money on imports and do nothing with it. And afterwards, we also have to look at people's rights. How can we legitimize the system? If the system perceives people as citizens, it has to give people healthcare, education, housing, jobs, all of these things to cement stability, not only in a country, but also in a region that has been extremely divided by sectarian tensions. I believe that Lebanon can be an example for other countries. Most other countries are a bit more homogenous. For example, the Gulf countries, they are religious states that their legitimacy relies on religion. Lebanon is a mix of 17 to 18 different sects, so we cannot have kind of legitimacy. However, all of the region requires a lot of things like economic stability, prosperity, development, and these things can come from the Lebanese system that I imagine, at least, and it can radiate this kind of influence into the region.
I think for everything you're speaking about, the baseline is that Lebanon needs peace without getting interrupted every handful of years by
Of course.
instability and war.
Of course, this is absolutely a
so-
prerequisite. Yeah.
Exactly.
But if I just may say one thing, I completely agree that yes, there has to be peace and stability in Lebanon. We cannot wait until the conflict in the region, the central problem, which is Israel, to be settled in order to do something, or then we just wait. Like there's a lot of pressing issues in Lebanon that cannot wait. If we wait until the Israel situation is resolved, Lebanon itself might disintegrate. And then we will be something else. We would become maybe something like Syria, a country on the verge of being fragmented into pieces. There's a balance between both. Some things can be done. At the same time, speaking long-term, prosperity and development and stability cannot be done as long as we have a country at our border that every couple of years attacks the country and destroys its infrastructure and also undermines it continuously. We've seen in this war, the intel that they have gathered on Lebanon is a process that has taken at least a decade. So yeah, I agree, but with some reservations.
Just to piggyback on that, it's more for the benefit of our audience. Most of our audience here in the United States, the Western, is that Lebanon, like the countries in the region itself, they're operating under extreme pressures. They're trying to develop and they're trying to do the best they can under unnormal circumstances, things that people in the West can't really relate to because our political system in the West and how things function in the West, they're operating on the pristine time. They're not under threat, they're not in war, they're not constantly invaded, they're not constantly being interrupted, they're not constantly being wafted, they're not constantly being cooled. Whereas the countries in the region, in the Levant area, and a lot of global South countries, right? They're having to operate with small resources, little bit of resources. They got to make the most they can with the resources they have under extreme pressures and extreme circumstances brought to them by the colonial enclave in the region, which is Israel, and outside powers, i.e. France, the United States, Britain, etc. Let me shift on this real quick. October 7th happened. The coalition of militia factions in Gaza conducted a raid on Israeli military installations, what they called the Gaza Amble. Israel retaliated, and the next day, on October 9, the Lebanese resistance militia called Hezbollah announced they would inject themselves in the conflict also to balance and pin Israel. This evolved into a tit-for-tat a whole year between Israeli forces and Hezbollah forces. Lebanon has an army. However, the army in Lebanon pretty much sat on the sidelines and didn't react. This evolved into a really intense war towards the end of last year. It lasted about 56 days, where the Israeli first started with a pager attack or a cell phone attack, which killed hundreds of people, injured like 3,000 people. That was followed by a decapitation campaign. They killed pretty much the top leadership of Hezbollah. Meanwhile, they were trying to invade the southern parts of Lebanon, which the Hezbollah fighters resisted and pushed back. How has this war impacted the immediate Lebanese infrastructure, economy, social fabric, and its relations with Israel? And
That's a very tough question. I think we still have not fully understood the scope of the damage in Lebanon. The major reason for that is that Israel is continuously violating the ceasefire. So we're so far at more than 1,500 Israeli violations of the ceasefire. They are still bombing, burning, blowing up houses, roads, and land in the south, in areas that they were supposed to leave. And they entered areas that they were not able to enter during the war, but they were able to enter them during the ceasefire, because Hezbollah was respecting the ceasefire and refused to breach it in any way. But Israel kept on advancing and is abusing. The ceasefire was extended until February 18th. For your Western audience, you might think that the extension of a ceasefire is a good thing because that means the war has ended. But in the case of Lebanon, it's the opposite. It means that Israel will have its impunity in South Lebanon until February 18th. So from that perspective, we still do not know the extent of the damage in the south. Second, we still do not know once you relaunch this economy and if things go back to quote unquote normal, a lot of people might have decided to leave. We need hindsight to see if people have left or will leave in the coming months as a result of the war, because I know for a fact that a lot of people during this war have lost all hope. They are terrified and also witnessed genocide at our border that has been going on for more than a year. This has terrified a lot of people. Some of them just cannot deal with that anymore. They also want to leave. This is probably the gravest economic loss. This is something we also cannot assess today. Otherwise, there are some economic indicators, of course, that the GDP shrank and unemployment rose, poverty increased. These things already happened and some businesses closed as well. Whether or not they can recuperate is because this will depend on the government that was formed yesterday. We still haven't seen how the new government will respond to all of this damage, but they vow that they will engage in reconstruction. We're just in a very early phase to be able to tell. I can tell you that the mass migration that happened inside Lebanon, the extent of the damage, particularly in South Lebanon, from videos, pictures, from people that went and told me, it is extreme. And even though Hezbollah is trying to care for their people, dispersing funds for reconstruction, they are not enough. Reconstruction requires effort, mustering a lot of people and state capabilities that today are not present. And the more there is the extent of the damage, but also the duration in which it lasts, that impacts the long-term economy. The longer these damages remain, the more acute will be the long-term consequences on the Lebanese economy. So we'll have to wait and see, but the damages are quite severe.
So I read this article that you wrote, is Israel using depleted uranium to bomb Lebanon? You talk about Israel's potential use of uranium bombs in the attack of Lebanon and the lingering health effects that uranium has. You also make examples with Iraq. Iraq was used depleted uranium by American forces and the health effects that has caused the Iraqi population. Not only the Iraqi population, you also mentioned in the article how that affected the American soldiers' self and how Israel also had used it in the 2006 war. Can you elaborate more on that and the health risks behind it and the long-term effect to the environment and to the communities?
Yeah. First, let me just start with, I guess, to your audience, the most shocking part. During the bombing campaigns of Israel, particularly in the southern suburb of Beirut, the syndicate of chemists in Lebanon raised an alarm and said that Israel might have used depleted uranium and called for an investigation. This investigation did happen. At the time I wrote the article, the results were still not out, even though they were supposed to have been out. Later on, the results came. They took samples from specific strikes, particularly where Sayyid Nasrallah was martyred. It turned out they didn't find depleted uranium in these samples. In the article, I also spoke to Elijah Manier, a war correspondent and expert on the topic. He said these investigations are usually heavily politicized because documenting the fact that somebody used today can cause a lot of problems in the international scene. So yeah, there's that. Otherwise, I have already researched extensively the use of depleted uranium in Iraq by US forces. Funny enough, Israel was one of the first countries to test out the military applications of depleted uranium.
What you just said there is very important, very critical about these documents and this investigation being politicized. You follow the reporting of Aaron Mate and others, and you talk about the chemical attacks in Syria, for example, when they did when they did investigation initially, they put the finger at the Syrian government for launching the attack. A whistleblower came out saying that when they wrote the report, they were under heavy pressure to point the finger at the Assad government, right? The initial report placed the blame on the insurgents. Just want to note that with what you said about politicizing reports.
That makes sense. The thing about these issues is that we will probably never have an answer, because taking a sample from a specific time, the specific area, and making sure that it's analyzed correctly and all that, even if you decide at some point, okay, fine, there was a mistake in this, going back like in retrospect and trying to identify whether or not some use of chemical or radioactive weapons was used at a certain point in time might become more difficult in retrospect. So yeah, unfortunately, these kinds of issues, we might never have clear answers regarding these allegations. But in the case of Iraq, I think it's a bit more interesting because the US did not deny that they used depleted uranium. On the contrary. And I don't know if your audience might be aware of it, but depleted uranium is basically the garbage of uranium. It's the stuff that we discard once we purify uranium to use for nuclear energy or atomic bombs. This leftover is cheap because technically it is garbage. And it has a very high density, so it's excellent to make armor and also armor-piercing weapons like tank shells and even bullets. Once that you launch a tank shell at a bunker, this ammunition hits the target and then is able to pierce it and enter it. And then it fragments into thousands of pieces of, some of it is dust, some of it is shrapnel. They all catch fire. They incinerate instantaneously. And whoever is inside will either die by being shredded by these pieces, burned, or by inhaling the dust. Depleted uranium is radioactive and emits alpha waves, not gamma waves, just alpha. And these alpha waves, if they are outside of the body, they cannot penetrate it. The skin is enough to protect you from alpha radiation. However, if they are inhaled or inside of your body, either through shrapnel or ingested, the radioactivity will start to affect you. They deposit in the kidneys and then the liver and the bone marrow, and they cause a series of cancers. This is how the use of was identified in Iraq through the medical cases of the veterans that came back to the UK and the US. They saw a very high incidence of cancers among them. They saw congenital malformation or even infertility. Their children were born with these congenital malformations. In Iraq as well, later on, it was found, there was a study done in the late 90s, early 2000s. The incidences of cancer among children is terrifying after the first Gulf War. And also there's extensive documentation of congenital malformations in Iraq. You see all sorts of malformations, kids being born with 2 heads, 2 spines, no arms, no legs. It's truly absolutely terrifying. The problem with the use of uranium is that, first of all, its half-life, the time that it takes for half of the quantity of depleted uranium to stop being radioactive, is at least 100 million years. This is something that will probably outlast humanity. This is the first problem. The second problem is that this dust that is radioactive spreads around. It's carried by wind. After the Gulf War, a center in the UK that monitors radioactivity levels, and they were able to detect a spike in radioactivity from the use of depleted uranium in Iraq. So the wind carried depleted uranium from Iraq to the UK. This is how far it goes. And then it seeps into the soil, the water, plants, animals, humans, and it's extremely costly to clean it up. For example, during the first Gulf War, when Saddam invaded Kuwait and the US intervened, the US used depleted uranium inside Kuwait, their supposed ally at the time. Then after the war was over, Kuwait demanded the US to clean up the depleted uranium that they left. It took them years, and the US kept denying it. They said, no, it's too expensive, we can't do it. Eventually, they decided to do a limited cleanup operation. They had to remove around 90 tons of sand, I don't know how many shrapnels and bullets, and they moved, I think, 2 tanks. They buried them somewhere in the US, if I'm not mistaken, in Ohio. Despite people there protesting, they forced them to hold depleted uranium material inside their area. They found more tanks contaminated with depleted uranium in Kuwait, wrapped them up in plastic and buried them in the desert. Imagine wrapping depleted uranium in plastic and burying it in the desert and then calling it a day. We're like, okay, we're done here. The use of these weapons is extremely dangerous. If you open the NATO website and look at their entry on depleted uranium, you will find a single entry that says NATO is unable to verify whether or not depleted uranium causes negative health effects. They do not deny that they use depleted uranium, but they deny the negative health effects of depleted uranium.
I appreciate that explanation. For myself, and I think probably for much of our audience, we are familiar with the use of depleted uranium and maybe even the health consequences of it. I first heard about it reading an article about physicians in Fallujah advising people not to have children because of issues with childbirth and deformities. Your description of the situation as being highly politicized, as Jovanni mentioned, the so-called chemical attacks in Syria being heavily politicized in ways that have been exposed by Aaron Mate and others. I don't think we're surprised by this because this is the freedom that the might makes right, where the United States gets to criminally and illegally invade countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other places And similarly, Israel gets to invade and commit mass war crimes in its region as well. We did want to go to Palestine and basically just talk about the genocide. For the most part, we're all on the same page here, but just for our audience, the situation in Palestine, do you believe the term genocide is applicable to the situation? And if so, what evidence supports this claim?
Around October 20th, 2023, I published an article. I was following up on the health situation in Gaza from the very beginning, and I called it genocide then. It became extremely clear the moment Israel struck Al Ma'madani hospital, the first hospital, with this thermobaric bomb that killed 300 people that were taking shelter inside the hospital. This was the first strike, and everybody was panicking, and it was the litmus test that the world has failed. It gave Israel a green light to target all other hospitals. From that moment onwards, it was clear that it was a genocide. And if you combine it with, I think it was a Smotrich who said it on October 8th or 9th, we're going to have a tight siege on Gaza, no food, no water, no electricity. The intent is there. The first test was the bombing of the Ahli hospital. The rest is history because it's only a year ago. More interestingly, you can look at statements by this Israeli general. They call him an intellectual. I am not sure what kind of metrics they're applying to this guy. He wrote an op-ed at some point early in the war, and he said that once all of Hamas leaders and once they're all sick and they look at their children and they're all sick, they're ridden by disease, then we'll win the war because they'll just stop fighting. They'll be too weak to fight, and our army, the IOF, it will be very easy for them to fight them. So he was promoting a policy to enable the spread of disease inside Gaza. Later on, that same guy, he's the one who also came up with the plan to depopulate northern Gaza. And he recommended cutting off food completely so that everybody in the north would leave and they would be able to annex northern Gaza. Obviously, he failed. But the promotion of the spread of diseases was an active policy. And we've seen it at some point, and maybe even currently. Everybody is sick in Gaza. They have respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal diseases. Everybody had like the flu and diarrhea. These things are extremely debilitating. And once you combine disease with hunger and wounds, like even the most basic wounds stop healing when you're sick and you're malnourished. So if somebody hits you with a small bullet, if it grazes you, it will never heal. It will get infected. It will get worse. And then you'll die from a very simple wound. Extrapolate this to a population of 2.2 million people cramped in ever smaller areas. When you see that, for example, it's enough to think about the bodies, at least 70,000, if not more. You had 70,000 bodies rotting away at the same time among people in these very small quarters. What about the garbage? Humans, when you're alive, you consume things, you produce garbage. Back before October 7th, you had all of the border area of Gaza where they would bury the garbage. After that, Israel stopped anybody from getting close to the barrier. So they had to throw the garbage wherever they are, so they're exposed to garbage. You had also all of the sewage. People are still alive. They produce feces and urine. This went into where people were living, like in their tents and across the streets. It is truly horrific to see what has been done to Palestinians. I don't think it has been done anywhere, and at this and to this magnitude. And then I am terrified to think about the future. This is such a dangerous precedent. We have no idea what's coming, really. I have never seen a specific deliberate targeting of health infrastructure, of healthcare professionals, of every infrastructure or every factor that makes life a possibility on Earth be reduced to dust and targeted on purpose. And this is truly something that we will have to reckon with as humanity. The fact that the West remained silent while this genocide was being perpetrated, this is something that they will have to reckon with. And now the US administration and Trump are gearing up for war with China from what we're seeing. I don't think they truly understand what they've done. They have given all of their enemies a carte blanche because whatever anyone does will always be compared to what has been done to Gaza, and nothing, I assure you, nothing will come close to what has happened to Gaza.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. A lot of people in the audience, people in the West, here in the United States, they will look at what happened in Gaza and Palestine pretty much for the last 75, 76 years. And their cop out is complicated, too complicated. I encourage those to see this from the lens of American history. What you described did happen in American history with its indigenous population, cutting off the food source, particularly the plain wars against the Indians, where their food source was buffalo. They pretty much exterminated the buffalo to cut them off food source.
The promotion of diseases was the flu.
the selling of garments infected with smallpox to kill off the population, indigenous population that relied on agriculture, would set their agriculture on fire, scorch earth so they'd be able to feed themselves and contaminate the water and stuff. So a lot of things that Israel is doing now pretty much cosplay to what was done here in the Americas to the native people. Right? So if you see it from that lens, because we already know that history, but if you see it from that lens, it shouldn't be too complicated to understand what's happening in Palestine, this Israeli colonists. Another thought I had, you mentioned the West, the silence of the West, the silence of the international community. I hear that a lot. I disagree on that because they weren't silenced. They were actually active participants, right? They were actively promoting it, actively pushing for it. Donald Trump just came in saying they will stop the war. They did broke that ceasefire in the first days of his presidency, but at the same time, he just sent $1 billion worth of munitions to Israel right after that. So it's not silent. The collective West is actually complicit, actively participant. And not only that, there was anyone else bringing the rule of law, for example, South Africa and others, the judges, the judicials, the ICJ and ICC.
Even the domestic opposition as well.
And with sanctions, the judges and stuff like that. So there were no silence. They were what was happening. They were pushing for it. And there's more related to that, the Palestinians, that there's more to it, why they were so actively and giddy. Germany, for example, was very giddy about supporting Israel. They were like the second, Germany after the United States is the second state to finance it equip the Israeli military. Which is interesting because everything falls back to October 7th, right? They keep saying October 7th is the worst attacks against Jews since the Holocaust, etc. Right? But if you saw that when it came later, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant just admitted days ago the Hannibal Directive was applied to it. The Hannibal Directive is that they would avoid the enemy getting captives by killing the captive. But then the old people, before they allow the enemy to take Israeli soldiers captive, they'll kill their soldiers first. That the response to October 7th, the Israeli military came in guns blazing, and they used the directive, implying that much of the Israeli civilians that were killed that night were killed by the Israeli military. Your thoughts on that?
It's something that has been discussed extensively. I don't know if you remember back around those days when we looked at the charred cars and bodies. And then we looked at Palestinians and the fighters who had machine guns, and we're like, how were they able to inflict this kind of damage? This is not, we look at their weapons and we look at the damage and they're completely incompatible. Then, of course, it goes back always to one thing. We've touched on it earlier. And that is that the West always has these atrocity narratives that have to be manufactured in order to justify imperialist wars. The difference between you comparing the history of the US to what's happening in Palestine. And it's true, but with only one difference, that contrary, the colonization of the Americas by Europeans, they almost eradicated more than 90% of the indigenous population. The only difference is that in Palestine, the other European settlers failed to accomplish that. They're at 50-50 in terms of the population, white settlers versus indigenous people. We're at 50%. And this is not a sustainable statistic for colonization because it implies a lot of dangers, things that Israel realizes. And this is why they engaged in a massive campaign of genocide. The policy of genocide happened out of a vacuum is ridiculous. This is something that is also planned. The amount of preparation required, of hatred that has to be stoked in the heart of people, of soldiers, to be able to carry out this massive destruction of people living in a small enclave of land takes preparation. This is not something that happens out of nowhere. Whether you require an atrocity narrative like 40 beheaded babies or massive rapes that still haven't been proven, or putting kids in an oven, the global South knows these atrocity narratives because they've experienced them. They are the ones who experienced colonization. So we're very familiar with these stories because we've experienced them ourselves and our ancestors who have documented some of these stories. So yes, of course, this was targeted, the manufacturing of these atrocity narratives. The target audience was not us. It was not the global South, obviously. It was the West, and it was particularly Europe and the United States. In order for them to quell, not even to convince the leaders, but to quell the domestic opposition, to give ammo for the oligarchy of these countries to suppress their own people as they, as you said earlier, enable and carry out also themselves a genocide. And then you'll see that it was not just the US, it was also the UK continuously flying the flights and surveillance. There was France and Germany that sent also warships to the Middle East. One of them, by the way, even Germany participates in the patrolling of the seas with the UN in Lebanon. At some point during the war, Israel entered Lebanese territory in Batroun. This is in northern Lebanon. even above Beirut. They entered with a boat and kidnapped a Lebanese citizen from Batroun. And it is said at a time that the German ship from the UN that was supposed to be patrolling the seas stepped aside to allow Israelis to kidnap somebody from Lebanese territory and then get out. We still don't know what happened to this man, by the way. I think he was studying to become a pilot of a ship, but we still have no idea. You'll find that everybody is actively participating in it, and this atrocity narrative is something that they're concocting for themselves. It is not convincing the world, especially not the global south that is very well experienced with Western imperial tactics.
Thank you for that. I think that's a perfect segue into broadening it out into the region a little bit. The last time I was on this program with Jovanni was in the wake of the fall of Damascus this past November. We both found it incredibly frustrating that we've been organizing with in support of Palestine. We're cheering the fall of the Syrian government. My assessment was that the falls on the pro-Palestinian movement in the United States, which correctly described the genocide and called for the end of U.S. support for Israel. But these movements failed to discuss and educate about the broader resistance against Zionism and Western imperialism, the so-called axis of resistance. And they failed to situate these forces within the struggle for Palestinian liberation and then the liberation of the region more broadly from Zionism and imperialism. So how should pro-Palestine activists in the West understand this axis of resistance, the struggle for a liberated Palestine, as well as the struggle for a region free from the violence and domination of the Zionist and imperialist alliance?
Mm-hmm. Of course, the notion of the axis of resistance came as a term in reaction to George Bush's axis of evil. It's just it's a narrative. It's not really a thing that is real. And of course, over time, the term started to carry more weight. It was put to the test with the genocide in Gaza, and we saw that Yemen and Lebanon and Syria participated in trying to stop Israel from committing genocide at different rates, different forms of participation, and all that. However, today, with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, we see the collapse of the axis, but not in the sense that the pro-Western, pro-Israel people would like to see it, as if all of it has collapsed. This is not true. We have to look back at how this axis was formed. These are semi-autonomous units of people that resisted Western imperialism in one form or another, and they received support from Iran. Iran did not connect them with each other. Qasem Soleimani did work a bit on that for a while, but it was mostly about supporting them wherever they are in their own areas. This was basically Iran's foreign policy goal of keeping conflict outside of Iran after its war in the 80s. So from that perspective, yes, like the units are still there. And to think that, for example, the fall of the Assad government in Syria did knock out a core part of this, in the sense that weapons came through Syria to Palestine and to Lebanon. But they still are. That's the thing. And today, yes, we have Jovanni, the ex-deputy ISIS leader, in charge of Syria. But to think that he emulates the power of the previous regime would be a big misdiagnosis of the situation. He's maybe in charge of Aleppo and Damascus, but Syria is far bigger than that. And today, there's a lot of contestation happening against him. It was more than of a circumstantial alliance between him and 50 or 60 other Islamist groups that took him to power, and of course the collapse of the Syrian regime. There's also a lot to be said about how Assad ran the country and how he spent his time, the time where there was no active warfare, and he did not reinforce neither his military nor his regime, his relationship to his people, nor even with the resistance, because we also saw that there were plans to use the Julan as another front to attack Israel. Bashar al-Assad might have prohibited the resistance from using this area because he was promised by Gulf countries, the UAE specifically, that if he doesn't do that, there might be some form of rapprochement between them. Of course, this was all a lie and a mistake on his part. It doesn't change the fact today that Syria is not the Syria pre-2011 in the hands of ex-ISIS people. Syria is a country that has been ravaged by war, with more than $1 trillion worth of losses, mass migration outside of the country. It is fragmented even from it's something a bit like that reminds me a bit of the Lebanese civil war. So you have in the south the Jewish population, Sunni population. These people are almost at war with each other. They also want to become semi-independent entities. You have the Kurds in the north. You have the national Syrian army that Turkey established, not to be confused with the Syrian Arab army. Turkey like combined, I think, 30 Islamist groups into one. It called it the Syrian National Army. So there was supposedly an ally of Jolani, and they pushed into Aleppo. And as soon as they took Aleppo, problems started between each other. Now this army is attacking the Kurds. Jolani doesn't want to attack the Kurds because he wants to please the Americans. It's a complete mess. The whole thing is a complete mess. It is something along the lines of Libya, but different, in the sense that it's not going to be split in two, maybe into many different pieces. And we still don't know how it's going to go, because Jolani walked to Damascus. Jolani did not defeat the Syrian Arab army. It just decided not to fight because they were exhausted, underpaid, and just sick of the status quo that was untenable. This is his biggest problem, that this guy does not have legitimacy by power through sheer force in Syria. So today, anybody that looks at Jolani might have the same realization that if this guy did it, he just walked to Damascus, why can't I just walk to Damascus and be the next guy in charge? I think all of them are quite ambitious. Any leader of any faction, however small or big, is ambitious to try and have his own attempt at taking control of Syria. But at the same time, regionally speaking, there's a lot of problems that are brewing. So first of all, Turkey and Qatar, as sponsors of Jolani, are the ones that basically now have dominance over Syria. This does not please Saudi Arabia, nor does it please the UAE. And these people will definitely try their best to undermine the rise of Turkey as an even more powerful regional player, because it undermines their position in the region. If you look at Jolani, he's in quite the pickles. He needs to please the West because he needs the sanctions to be lifted from Syria. Without lifting them, he cannot do anything. The same sanctions that destroyed Bashar al-Assad's ability to do anything in Syria will destroy Jolani as well. Second, he has to please the Turks because they are the ones that supported him. And what they want is to extract as much as possible from Syria. They already flooded the market with their products. They're expanding with military bases. They want to be there because Syria could be the crown jewel for Turkey's expansionist ambition. He wants to please the Gulf as well, because this is where the money for reconstruction is. These guys don't want to see him succeed, because if he succeeds, Turkey succeeds. He needs to please everyone. Worst of all is domestically. This guy is in charge of radical Salafi Islamist groups. These guys have a very strict notion of how things should be going in the country. So you cannot please all of them, previous regional powers, and your own people at the same time. You cannot please the West and the Islamists of ISIS at the same time. These people want very different things. So in the end, this is truly a recipe for chaos. And I think one of his biggest mistakes, Jolani, strictly from an intellectual observation, you cannot be in charge of a country and try to please everyone. You have to make a choice. And this guy is refusing to make a choice. And at the same time, he's behaving as if he is controlling all of Syria, pre-2011 Syria, which is a myth. The guy is in charge of a few cities. That's about it. For example, Druze in southern Syria, who are armed and very well armed, refuse to let go of their weapons. And Israel is also promoting some narratives of, oh yeah, we can have a Druze country on our northern border. It will be good for us. And maybe another smaller Sunni country and another one in the north of Syria will divide it and we'll give it to the Alawites. That's all. This is a problem. The guy is definitely in over his head. And at the same time, he's also embarked on a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Homs. A couple of weeks ago, they launched a campaign where they started butchering and killing a lot of Alawites and Shia. 5 days ago, they reached the border town between Lebanon and Syria. We don't know that the borders are a bit blurry. You have villages that are part in Syria, part in Lebanon, and they're mixed. So you had families of Lebanese and Syrians. It's unknown which is which. But they go into one of these villages in the northern Bekaa region of Lebanon, and they kidnap 14 people, mostly women. It turns out that these people were Lebanese citizens and belonged to a very well-armed tribe in the Bekaa. Then they started pushing forward beyond this village into Lebanese territory. And then this tribe in the Bekaa kidnaps these HTS fighters and exchanges them for the 14 Lebanese citizens that they kidnapped. Today, if it's not announced, but we're at war with Syria. Now there's been, for the past 5 days, there is a huge battle taking place in the northern Bekaa between the tribes of the Bekaa. Apparently seems to be taking quite the hit. They're using ATGMs, they're using drones, and these tribesmen are dropping their drones to the ground. They did not come to Lebanon, but he sent a few messages to Lebanese officials that, yes, we want to have a good relationship with you, an equal relationship and all that. The president called him, I think 2 days ago, in order to calm things down at the border. Yesterday, things escalated further. Today, the battle is still going on as we speak. This means one of two things. Either it has no control at all over these people, or he's at war with Lebanon. In both cases, it's not good for him. We're still talking strictly about the tribes in northern Bekaa. Hezbollah is not involved in this yet at all. And there's this joke that we use in Lebanon that even Hezbollah does not mess around with these tribes because they're very tough. Yep. This is the situation of Syria, and it's a complete disaster. But this does not mean that when going back to Palestine, the thing that we lack in the region is a program for the people of the region. How can we combine a vision of how we're supposed to be living in this region beyond sectarianism and imperialism, beyond us being client states of Western powers? This is, I think, the core issue in the region. We might find that the answer is not through these artificially drawn borders of Sykes-Picot that were drawn by foreign powers also, that demarcated Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and all of these, and even Palestine. We still have a lot of work to do, but we do not have to be silent when something is wrong. Like when we see that there is people living in dire circumstances, we do not say that, oh, okay, yes, we're going to be silent on the plight of the Syrian people for the sake of Palestinians. At the same time, we do not say that the real opposition and freedom for the Syrian people will come from the ex-deputy leader of ISIS. We have to be rational about this. There's something about what happened in Syria that always seems to reinvigorate sectarian divides in the region. From 2011 until today, whenever you find these moments of unity in the region, you have Syria back on the table and everybody's divided again. And for some reason, people are not rational about Syria. I truly do not have an answer to that. I don't know why, but people are just not rational about it. When you look at Jovanni and his like amazing CV in terrorism and the videos that his group has recorded of burning a Jordanian pilot and even taking the border area between Lebanon and Syria. Then they kidnapped 20 Lebanese soldiers. Some of them were beheaded. Hezbollah defeated them to get them back. And the videos from Idlib as well, of people being killed in the streets, women being killed for cheating on their husbands, allegedly. This is not the guy that will bring freedom to anybody. This guy is a disaster. And he dedicated his entire life for that. You think that now that he's in charge of Syria, things are going to turn for the better? He's going to go to therapy and realize he was mistaken this whole time and become a better person? This is an abusive relationship.
That's what he said when he was interviewed on CNN. They say he became a better person. He said that was mistakes of his youth. Right? Fighting to the government, one of the persons accused of beheading that 14-year-old Palestinian boy. That reminds me of what you just said about the project that the West Asia needs. Remind me of what the first secretary of NATO, Lord, said back in Europe when NATO was formed, is that the functions of NATO to keep the Soviets out in Europe, keep the Americans in Europe, keep the Germans down. What's happening in Lebanon and in the Gulf states and pretty much West Asia, it's similar. The Americans are in, the Iranians and the Russians are out, and the Arabs are down. Pretty much the same mindset that I see here. And instead of NATO, they use Israel. Yeah. Any comments or that, Mark?
I would just say that there's much change coming to the region. I think from a geopolitical perspective, with Trump's attention turning to China and making all of his statements around Mexico, Canada, Greenland, and Panama. Yes, okay, some people interpret them as the ravings of the madman, but I look at him and I see a man gearing up for war, and he's up for war with Russia and China. So from that perspective, from somebody who lives in the Middle East, I am not too concerned by these changes. The shift that's happening to another hemisphere of the world, I'm personally fine with that because we could use a break. This kind of break as well will imply a lot of changes. There's a lot of governments and regimes in the region that were positioned to please the Americans and are contingent on the American presence and attention on the region. A lot of these regimes might collapse. We're sensing their anguish already. For example, Jordan and Egypt are terrified now that Israel wants to push out Palestinians into their own territories. The Gulf is trying to reconfigure itself. The Gulf is not that subservient anymore. For example, like today or yesterday when Israel said, oh, yeah, we'll just send the Palestinians to Saudi Arabia. All of the Arab countries are coming out in condemnation and saying, hell no. And because also the Gulf has invested a lot of money into their own development. And I don't think they are that willing to sacrifice all of that, to set it all on fire just for the sake of Israel. There's also limits to how much you can push a project that truly doesn't seem to be progressing anywhere. Like the more time passes on the Zionist project, the more you see like you're back to square one. So from a strictly business understanding, you keep putting money and resources into this project. This project is not working. You keep sacrificing things, your position, how people perceive you as a country, your diplomatic relationships, for the sake of this project is still not working. So at some point, somebody's going to be like, this is enough. And already a lot of people are saying this is enough. From a moral perspective, politically, they're saying it. and economically also. And I think the moment we hit the economic perception of how costly the Zionist project is becoming, this is how all empires, all of the Western empires have fallen. It always boils down to money. And when it's not profitable anymore, they just dropped it. This is how India was freed. This is how most of the global South was freed, when occupation became just too costly.
Yeah, I think we've seen it basically since World War II, at least. The days of colonialism are over. There are vestiges that are still present, and neo-colonialism is another form. But we've seen time and time again, both the United States, Israel, they're able to destroy, but they're unable to actually win. They're unable to maintain an occupation. And this has been the case for a long time now. I completely agree that there are changes coming, and the anachronistic character of this situation is coming to a head with reality.
I think this is a good place to wrap up for the day. Dr. Germani, thank you so much for coming to the show, spending some of your time with us and sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure.
Any last thoughts before we depart?
I think as bleak as everything is, because it's not just like how it looks, I think there will definitely be better days ahead. We just have to keep a cool mind and honor the martyrs by learning from the lessons we've all witnessed, and making sure these things do not happen again, and steer the path of history to a better outcome. I do not agree that the arc of history bends towards justice. It is the people that bends it towards justice.
Absolutely. Jake, any thoughts before we depart?
No, I just really appreciate this discussion, Dr. Germani. I learned a lot. Thank you, Jovanni, for the invite. Always love being on the program.
Appreciate you coming in. Thank you for joining us today. Today is February the 9th, 2025. Like us, subscribe to our channel, to YouTube channels on X and Instagram, and listen for us and any of your podcast platforms that you listen. Please share us with your friends. Help us grow. Stay tuned for our next episode. Take care.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks: Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helgeberg. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch.
We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes
at www.fortressonahill.com.
Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.